Alright, and we finally made it back to our book study of Relationship Anarchy, Occupy Intimacy. A book study where I received express permission to read sections of the book since I've been reading kind of chunks. But now we are talking about chapter 3, where we're getting into the idea of labels and relationship models and what Relationship Anarchy proposes as an option for these things, or alternatives, or possibilities. So first, I just wanted to read the quote at the top of this chapter, which is by Alok Vidmanan. Conformity requires us to minimize our differences for the greater good. We fear that if we don't conform, we will be abandoned, but there's no loneliness like having people only see you after you've erased yourself. Powerful words. I imagine one of the things that can often be really difficult with practicing RA or like moving into this philosophy is, what do you do about labels, right? If we are looking at how we can deconstruct these ideas of hierarchies and emphasize sovereignty and autonomy, and especially as he writes in this book a lot, along with always understanding that we're in a community and we're like self-managing relationships, but like not just as an island, but as connected to people, obviously. But yeah, the question comes like, well, so like, how do you talk about it? What do you even say? Like, what is even going on? And so I appreciate that this chapter, he really gets into that. And he says, simply being able to easily express what your life is like, your way of seeing and living it, where it's at, or even how you're feeling, this constitutes an important privilege. I don't think we often think about it as a privilege, right? But I will say this, like, as someone who has experienced like non-traditional work in my life, having done freelance, having sometimes just been unemployed at all, not only was it like hard to describe, but maybe sometimes I didn't want to. I do really see that there is a privilege in being able to just simply say something, like simply be like, oh, I work in HR, or like, oh, this is my job, XYZ, and it just makes sense to people rather than, what do you do? Well, I like creative freelancing, you know. So this is really interesting because he's saying this in the realm of relationships, right? So there is a privilege in being able just to say, right? Oh, I have a partner. Oh, I'm married. Oh, I'm this, right? This is simple. So then he goes on to say, this is a privilege you have to give up when you do things differently, in a way that has no name, or where nuances are important. Because another characteristic of hegemony, besides making oppressions and prejudices invisible, is digesting and assimilating nuances. We talk about a lot in this book, this idea of like hegemonic principles, hegemonic relationships, hegemony, where like there's these sort of like overarching ways of being in society. That's just like the given. And because of that, it's often simplified ideas, right? Like it has to be simplified, like move away from nuance, because then it wouldn't be so widely applicable, right? Or it couldn't be. Like if you want to say this is how we all do things, you have to dissolve nuances. So then he goes on to say, like, it's common to hear people say that relationship anarchy just gets rid of labels. But he's really going to move into the nuance about this as well, because it's not just this idea of getting rid of labels, right? Because then it becomes, I guess, a rule that everybody who practices RA would follow. And then it becomes, again, moving away from your self-determination, your ability to decide what you want to do. So it's, again, not just, oh, if everybody's doing this, I'm just going to do the opposite of that. It's really, I'm going to show up with incredible radical presence to decide along with the person, right? Mutual agreement between your relationships. Like if there are labels that make sense that I want to use. But I also do appreciate in this chapter where he pushes back and he says yes, like use labels if you want to, and understand that those labels aren't neutral words, right? Especially because in our society, we've put so much meaning around them that when you do use them, you have to be very aware, like kind of constantly aware about if that label is is in the back of your mind pushing you towards like expectations or things into sort of a prescribed way of being when that's not what you were intending to do. Considering that we've grown up under the hegemony of normative ties, that we've not been exposed to anything else, and that common sense is therefore the only thing we need, immediately leads to the question, what's wrong with calling things by their name? Why can't I say they're my partner when talking about someone who fills me with love, passion, and trust, someone I love spending time or even living with? Can we not go from being friends to being boyfriend and girlfriend or lover or a couple, or saying that we're together if we fall in love? Why deny that a relationship is over when it's not working anymore? Why can't we go from being a couple to being friends if we fall out of love? Of course we can. Relationship anarchy doesn't prohibit anything, not by any means, nor does it condemn, disapprove of, or reproach any of these positions. It simply warns that if we're interested in exploring a relational model based on the principles of anarchism and the ideas I've introduced and repeatedly mentioned in these pages, we must pay attention to the possibility that these labels condition us. They've got baggage. If we're not highly attentive to this, we will bring in authoritarian behaviors, automatic rights over others, the expectations they behave like they should, quote unquote, with me, or how everyone does they should, as someone who accepts that recipe for a pre-cooked plate of rights and obligations. So he's saying like the problem arises when you don't reflect on what the labels do within you or in the other person, right? Like how it's engaged in that relationship. Like, is the label supporting what you want to create in that relationship? Is it not? Are there times when you notice within yourself that if I use that word partner or lover or boyfriend or girlfriend, is that creating within me these expectations, it's sometimes beyond what was agreed upon, right? Am I feeling the sense that that has a weight to it that hasn't been established, you know? And like before you said too, like relationship anarchy isn't to say that you can't have like deep commitments and loyalty and all these things. It's like actually it really involves that. It involves that in a way where you are actually mutually agreeing upon it. And I kind of see it as like staying in real time with it. That we agree upon these things, but not like in a way that you might see in a traditional marriage where you stand up in front of people and you can make this one-time commitment, and that means the same thing from now until forever, as if life never changes. But that you are like checking in, like allowing for the evolution of things if there is, and that there's space for that. There's actually a conscious pursuit of following like what is actually happening and what people actually desire to create. And he's saying that like in with those labels, like yes, be conscious of what that generates within you, how that's associated with conditioning we've had around those labels. And also there's a sense of when you have a label, it will also impact how you feel about when you're no longer using those labels if you choose not to use them. Like if a relationship or breakups, right? So for example, in the traditional senses of using these terms, boyfriend, girlfriend, when you choose not to do that anymore, it's considered a breakup, it's considered a break of relationship. And then because of that, and because those labels were used, it can really influence how you feel about what happens, how long you feel that grief, for example, because of how much was put into the label of that. So he says it can mean months or years of heartbreak. It might precede months or years of doubt, grief, trying it again. And worst of all, part of that discomfort and uncertainty is useless, brought on only by the need to name, delimit, and close off. So in that, he's really reflecting on what does it mean to use the label as you're moving into and then in a relationship, and then what does it mean when you're not in that same relationship and you no longer use those labels, that your experience of what's happening and this connection can be heavily influenced by all those, by the label and everything that's kind of baked into the label, especially if you're not bringing it to your awareness, you're not being conscious of it. But I think even so, we can have a lot that's already in our subconscious or our built-in senses about things because it was built in for so long from the beginning that it can take a lot to suddenly, consciously start choosing to look at these things differently and approach them differently, especially when we use the same language. It's hard. I do really appreciate that. He gets very real about it. He's like, this isn't easy. And he says later in this chapter, this is not a solution to anything. And that looking at these ideas of like radical different ways of approaching things is not a solution to a problem, right? Like, you're not going to solve the problem of relationships by being RA, whatever you think that means, in the sense of, well, now I don't have to deal with the messiness of relationships. You're just dealing with a different adventure of relationships, and which involves a lot more unknown, because you don't have the path that was deeply trodden by everybody else telling you how it goes. So it's not a solution, it's just it's something that's different. It's a different possibility. So I think that's important to think about. Why do I want to explore RA? Like, what draws me to that? What do I think I'm going to get out of that? Okay, so he talks a little bit about the labels, right? And essentially it boils down to use labels if you want to, right? Understanding that those labels are not neutral words, along with all the other ways you'll be unpacking and deconstructing and just getting really aware of how you show up in relationships with RA, the same with the language you use around it. It's just more opportunity to get really aware of what it means. And I will say this too, as someone who understands the process of deconstruction and self-awareness, you don't know what you don't know until you realize you don't know it, or until you hit up against it being triggered, right? So like, know that's going to be part of the process. That there's going to be these sneaky ways that our mind is like viewing things through our old filters that we aren't aware of, because we can't really force the awareness until it becomes aware. And sometimes that can be through something being triggered, or we come upon a scenario we haven't experienced before, and because of that, our mind will try to first put the old filters on it, which would make sense. Our mind's trying to figure out what to do with this thing that's in front of me. And the only way it makes sense is to throw out at least the initial filters that we're used to. And so if we haven't come upon an experience or scenario, then of course our mind is going to try to view it from what we had previously had in our mind. And so that is okay. It's just becomes an opportunity, right? Sometimes painful, sometimes exciting, cause it's not all bad or hard, Sometimes it can be like, oh, I haven't come upon this scenario and I feel myself questioning what this is. And if I notice I'm questioning before I start deciding what it must be or what it is, maybe I could just be like, cool, maybe I'll let myself find out what I want this to be. That can be fun too. So, yeah. Okay, so he was talking about labels, and now he moves into this idea of models. So yes, we've got labels, but that is to express what we're actually operating in, which are models of relationships. The term model encompasses a wide range of concepts, including a mold, a guide, an inspiration, something we want to copy, someone who lends their body to a design so that it can be appreciated, a miniature made to scale, a diagram or blueprint, or even the adjective used to describe a person, right? The mold, the thing, the models of relationships. And with that, he then goes on and explores many different axes, both individual and universal, around models of relationships. One of the biggest models that one would explore, especially with RA, is the model of the relationship escalator. And there's actually a whole book on the relationship escalator. Essentially, it's this idea that relationships are considered valid and successful if they are on this escalator of increasing commitment and enmeshment, often following the path of making contact, right, with someone, initiating a certain romantic element about it, or sexual element, claiming and defining the relationship, so we're starting to put labels on it, right? Establishing the relationships, maybe adjusting lifestyles so that you are now in closer proximity, commitment, even in a public sense, like a marriage, merging together. So for example, like now you're married, so now your finances are maybe a mutual endeavor. And then conclusion, which for some is unto death. For others, it would be the breaking up of that escalator of things, right? And he points out that, there are some ways that people are getting off of or choosing to be off of the relationship escalator with, like, for example, a lot of folks are choosing not to have children. And that was part of the traditional relationship escalator of things. It's like, not only do we get married, but then we create a family and what that means, like specifically through children. So this idea of this relationship escalator is really deconstructed in the relationship anarchy philosophy, because they're inherent within that as a hierarchy, that those who are on this escalator, especially as it moves up and gets more and more committed in a specific way, with labels and things, and enmeshed, it sort of silos off those people from a lot larger sense of community, from networks of communities and connections, from that mutual care and mutual aid that anarchy would invite us to, right? And also within that can be baked those expectations, can be baked within it, ignoring power dynamics. Because he mentions this in this chapter too a lot, that, unless you're really expressly and actively becoming aware of the power dynamics involved, that you can find yourself in relationships and dynamics where, like, maybe from the outside or from the label it seems equal, but the reality of it is that maybe one person actually has more power in that relationship. But if you're just saying, well, we're both partners together, without an understanding or awareness of the power dynamics, that could mean a lot different, right? Like one could be having a lot more influence over the other. And he says too here, polyamory is a coherent, ethical response to having to choose and give up one person to get closer to another. But it is still a response within the framework of relationship escalator. Like every other solution, without exception, including relationship anarchy, which is located outside this framework, this poses many difficulties. So many that it may not make sense to understand them as solutions, but rather as exciting adventures that are filled with uncertainty, right? So that's the part where he's like, okay, you might be involved in the model of relationship escalator, which could be monogamous or polyamorous, or you could be off of that, relationship anarchy, but none of these things could really be considered solutions. They're just alternatives, adventures, based on what you want in your life. So if I were to really think about my experience with the relationship escalator, I would say it was always assumed, for one. It wasn't only just assumed, but it was so romanticized, which I think is actually intentional, the way that relationship escalators, especially in the traditional sense, monogamy, marriage, is really pushed on women and AFAB individuals as this thing we need to focus on. Like, this is your goal in life. And especially when I was religious, it was even more so, like, very explicit as part of, like, your role is to be pursuing this. This is part of, like, your life purpose, So it was, like, deeply embedded in, like, my history of relationships. And like he's saying here, like, we all really, it's kind of a global concept. And so, like, if I really think back into, like, my relationships and how the escalator influenced me, I think that there was an element of feeling a sense of security with a label. But then also, it really doesn't do away with jealousy or fear. Sometimes it would even create more fear. Because of having something, you have the ability to lose it, right? So if I define this relationship around having a certain label, then I become even more, maybe anxious about the thought of losing, or the possibility that now there's something that can be lost because I've decided there's this new thing that now is. So that's the interesting thing about RA, or couldn't be, right, is that if I'm not focused on maintaining a label, which I actually really like. I heard this from someone else who was doing a presentation on relationship anarchy / nihilism, which was another possibility. And she was saying that, like, when we create relationships, the idea of them, we take one person another person, and then we create this third thing. So especially when you're working with labels and things like that, like you've decided, not only am I here with you, but I'm here with this construct of an idea about what we're doing, right? So there's this other thing that actually requires a lot of energy and requires us to engage with it rather than just with each other. So I have you, then I have our relationship and what that means. And what I'm kind of gathering is like with Relationship Anarchy, it's not that you're not being aware of what your connections are and your relationships to people, but that you are unattaching yourself from all of those shoulds. They shouldn't have to be anything. From those expectations put on by the way we're told relationships are meant to be. These sort of built-in things of boyfriend must be this, girlfriend must mean this, or partner must mean this, wife, whatever. Because also, too, when you have yourself, the other person, and the relationship, when the relationship is defined by the culture, the society, like what this third thing must be, then you haven't even explored if you care about certain things, but they can become such charged topics, charged things, expectations within the relationship, within the connection, within the thing that's happening right now. I feel like this gives me a lot of thought, too, because RA is something, like the philosophy of it is something that does resonate with me. Do I know to what extent? No. I want the challenge of being present, being aware, getting more and more aware of like what I'm putting into language, labels, relationships, expectations, like so that I can deconstruct a lot of it. Like I want to deconstruct the idea of expectations and things. I can get a sense that there is something really beautiful and powerful about operating with other people outside of the weight of those expectations, especially when they weren't necessarily self-created. But that we get these messages that a relationship is legitimate if XYZ is happening or not happening. I can feel a sense of legitimacy about my relationships if they fit into the model, right? But that's not self-created. I did not create that. I did not choose that. I might not even want that. And so that's what this philosophy is really calling me to. It's quite a practice of really exploring and getting more and more clear around like what is happening in myself and other people and these dynamics, how it relates to how I want to build community and networks of care. I will say, if I have to admit, this book is a bit hard for me. I feel like after multiple burnouts, after my time in school and graduate school and things, I just can't relate as well to academic writing. Also, the ADHD is strong and not medicated. And I'm having a hard time focusing. I do really like this book. It is difficult in some ways for me to continue on in the way I started. But you know what? Maybe that's very RA. Like, why would I have the expectation that I have to keep going in the way that I started? Yeah. So, yeah, labels. So right now, I'm kind of pondering, like, do I want labels? Do I want to explore possibilities of labels or not labels? Because as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, like, yeah, a label can put expectations on it. And so what would another practice be instead of a label? Like maybe saying, like, this is this person, like their name, right? And we do XYZ sometimes, and other times we don't. And then just like not have a label. That is a possibility. I think because labels, one of their functions is to make things simple. Like that's why someone would have a label so they don't have to keep explaining everything all the time. You know, what other types of things? Like, the thing is, I can sense within me that even if I chose some random word, but I'm using it to describe a certain type or dynamic within a relationship, I would probably automatically start putting hierarchies around it. So I don't know. I might need a practice of not having labels for a time just to get out of that automatic hierarchical thinking. Yeah. We shall see. My name is Lex. One of these days I will introduce myself at the beginning of the video. I think this book study will just happen over time, sporadically. Don't expect me to always be on this. In true ADHD fashion, I started strong. But because sometimes this is challenging for me to engage with, I'm going to let it come through, like flow as it does, and I'm going to have just create other videos as I want to, and that's how it's going to go. So, join me here again very soon. That is all.